goes through a lot of the sociology of risk and makes recommendations as to how one effectively communicates risk with the public. There's one chapter by some rather well-known risk scientists, Zwanenberg and Millstone, which describe three different paradigms for how one communicates risk. This is a rather judgmental description, and unfortunately these three different paradigms are roundly criticized by these authors. This earliest paradigm, which they talk about, is the technocratic approach. And in these folks' rather jaundiced view, this consists of scientists saying they know the absolute truth, and if the public doesn't understand it, the public doesn't know enough to understand science. And it's the goal of scientists to try to explain to the public. They also say that, well, this is based upon the idea that science knows the full truth about these matters. Another paradigm which they describe, which comes a bit later, is what they call the decisionist approach, which tries to set up a two-way communication with the public, but really the goal is to try to understand what the public wants and try to help the public understand policies that the government and scientists are recommending. So basically, scientists and policymakers are supposed to try to ask the public what it is they want and provide it. And they also criticize this as being not very effective. A third approach, which they soundly approve, is what they call a deliberative approach, in which the public is brought in on the process of risk assessment and helps identify with the scientists what the risks are, how the risks are framed, and so forth. And so it's not a question of the scientists identifying the hazards and presenting scientific truth to the public, but working out jointly with the public to identify what the hazards are and how risk issues are framed. Of course, a very important thing. The question that I'm interested in is how does the WHO process of communicating risks about electromagnetic fields or about other things fit in on this category? I'm referring now to this document by Zwanenberg and Millstone, which actually was published by WHO, and it could be thought of as being somewhat critical of WHO's process. Well, back to this Red Book, I think that it's fair to say that the Red Book approach is a paradigm of the technocratic approach to risk management, risk communication. And this tries to separate the science from the policy and the politics as if these can be separated. And this is the whole basis of WHO's approach. But I think also that the WHO, at least the EMF project, has managed to communicate about risks in a way that avoids at least the worst criticisms of these authors of this book, even though its approach is at heart somewhat technocratic. This can be seen in a book that the EMF project just recently published called Establishing a Dialogue on Risks from Electromagnetic Fields, which focuses continually on the need to set up effective communications with the public. Maybe you can't read the text at the bottom, but you can certainly download this or look at my slides. The project, EMF project, and its communications with the public then has been just very emphatic about the need to set up communication and the communication be two ways. The problem that WHO has, of course, is that its audience is basically the entire population of the world, which varies tremendously in social assumptions and mores and what have you. And so it's very hard to set up a kind of deliberative approach with the public when the public consists of such a huge number of people. And so that has limits that what WHO can effectively do.
Okay, excuse me, but before you move on, it would help us see the slides much better if you could switch to slideshow view on the presentation. And
that's a good one.
Okay, that's a lot better.
Sorry.
Oh, thanks. There we go.
Okay, so now this is from the WHO handbook on how to establish a dialogue on risks from electromagnetic fields, which says basically that a successful approach to evaluating risk communication should consider all aspects and parties involved and so forth. And later on it says risk communication is a forum for discussion on broad issues of ethical and moral concern, environmental issues that involve uncertainty as health risks require supportable decisions and so forth, emphasizing the transparency of the process. So although the WHO is really focused on producing scientific reviews of this rather controversial and rather emotional subject, it reflects a broad view of all the scientists who are involved with this project, which includes many health professionals and health agencies around the world, that one really does need to involve the public in communication. The other criticism that was raised about the so-called technocratic approach is the rather, to my mind, offensive assumption that scientists think they know the whole truth. If that is one of the definitions of the technocratic approach to risk communication, well, WHO certainly doesn't fall into that problem, because virtually everything WHO writes indicates that scientific knowledge is limited, and the WHO reports in this area tend to include long shopping lists of research that need to be done and gaps in the knowledge. In fact, they've been criticized by scientists and industry for basically prolonging the research longer than is needed. The problem, I think, is how one manages to assess this enormous literature on this field, which at this point has probably 10,000 papers of all description and is highly inconsistent and very emotional in places, in a way that provides a fair assessment of the science and of what's known and what's not known, in a way that helps educate the public and also doesn't unduly alarm people. WHO, I think, tries to present its conclusions in these environmental health statements as being a fair assessment of the science and a balanced review of the science and the consensus of the experts that prepared these documents, but not any kind of final truth about these issues. I guess the question is how this process can be improved. We know that there's still a tremendous amount of public anxiety about the use of cell phones. Health agencies on the whole are not willing to say there's a problem and not willing to say there's not a problem. And this then creates tremendous problems with communication between health agencies, who generally are unconvinced that a hazard has been identified, but don't want to say there's no problem. Whether one can go about this more intelligently than we or WHO or health agencies have done in the past, I just don't know. The other problem that I see myself is that the discussion about possible health effects of electromagnetic fields seems to be focused on the risk side of the issue and the hazard side, but clearly electromagnetic fields and electricity of all sorts has got tremendous health benefits. If we didn't have refrigerators and other appliances, we would be in much worse health. And so there's also some way to need to balance the discussion to focus also on the benefits that these technologies bring to people. This creates the kind of symmetrical problem in risk communication to communicate the benefits of the technology as well as the possible adverse effects of the technology. Now, I've told you basically everything I know about risk communication in about 10 minutes. If you want, we could have discussion now or question and answer.